Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure Podcast. I'm joined by my co-host, Rania Khalek. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're also pleased to have as a guest on the show, Eugene Puryear, who is a journalist with Breakthrough News. And Rania is also a journalist with Breakthrough News. Welcome, Eugene.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
Very
So,
incestuous. Our outlets are all very incestuous. We're just always through. Kevin's on our program. Eugene's on our program. It's just,
Great
this is
minds think alike.
fun. Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Yeah, we all have to do each other's shows in order to keep going. But no, importantly, I wanted to do this and have Eugene and also you, Rania, to talk about the trips that you took over the last couple of months. And we had a break. We had the winter break, so we didn't get to your trip to Ethiopia and Eritrea that both of you were on. And then, Rania, you went to Cuba, and obviously, Eugene, you're well familiar with Cuba, having produced this and worked and done interviews on this. So I'd like to talk about going to these three countries and the work that Breakthrough News has been doing. It's been fantastic. I mean, first, just off the bat, I'll just say that if you haven't had an opportunity to see some of these videos, make sure you go to Breakthrough News. And I have a little thing at the bottom, Breakthrough News on Twitter and YouTube, and find it. That's how it's spelled. That's how you can find it. It's Breakthrough, it's compound. And so, I mean, let's just begin with Cuba, and then we'll work our way backwards. So let's ask you, Rania, since you were on this trip with Breakthrough News, that when you went there, it seemed like a lot of what you wanted to explore or uncover was what was happening with the health system in Cuba. And then also, because we see a lot of headlines about the effect of the blockade, and what was the effect of the blockade on being able to deliver medical care and being able to take care of basic human needs.
I mean, yeah, I think that's one of the most exciting things about Cuba and getting to go there is they have this socialized medical system that really I think the world should be trying to adopt, especially when you look at the situation that we have in the US where people just literally go bankrupt from getting sick. And as we're watching with this pandemic play out, people have all kinds of chronic conditions that are totally preventative that only get as bad as they are because the US medical system is all about profit rather than prevention. And the Cuban system is literally the opposite of that. It's like, it's all based around prevention. It's all based around people having access to medical care from when they're babies to when they grow up. And by access, I mean, it's not only free, but like every neighborhood has like a neighborhood doctor or like a doctor on the street that basically is in charge of the people in this area. And everybody in that area, like they have a part of their house people can come visit. So if you need to go to the doctor for any reason, you can go to the doctor's house on your street. And if they can help you, they help you. And if they can't, they send you to the neighborhood clinic. Every neighborhood has a public clinic that has lots of doctors. There's a little bit more machinery there, the ability to do tests there. And if they can help you, great. If they can't, they send you to a hospital. And then if the hospital can't help you because you need really specialized care, they'll send you to a specialist. So it's this really cool, like layered system that the country has invested in a lot in since its revolution. And as a result, Cuba has really high social indicators that actually are on par with a lot of the social indicators that you'll see in rich countries in terms of like the mortality rate, the infant mortality rate, the maternal mortality rate, these kinds of things. And it's because they have such a high ratio of doctors to patients. I think it's the highest in the world, in fact. And so that was really incredible to see firsthand because I've heard of this, I know this, but to actually see it firsthand and to like speak to people, to speak to doctors, to speak to patients telling you they had to pay nothing and that they like laugh at you if you suggest that there's any system that exists where you do have to pay anything was really incredible and inspiring. And I mean, I really feel like that was the best part of my trip was getting to visit doctors. And also like there's something really cool in Cuba where all of these professions, whether it's in the scientific field or whatever field it is, all of these like really, serious professions are so politicized. Like we went to this vaccine production facility that was a really clean, scientific looking building, but there's like political quotes from Fidel Castro and Che Guevara all over the place. And when you talk to scientists and doctors, they actually have a revolutionary ideology. It's like the polar opposite of what you get in like a capitalist country like the US, where everything is the other way around. Like it's like either people are completely indifferent to politics or they're right wing when they work in like upper middle class professions.
And so Eugene, like all this stuff that like Rania was bringing back, and that people who, I assume you had some people who were assisting you while you were on the ground to get around there. These interviews, it seems like it's pretty striking. To me, it's pretty striking in this moment to view all of this, knowing the crisis of faith and the collapse that has been unfolding in our health care system in the United States. And obviously Cuba's a much, much smaller country, but if we would just find a way to scale up what they are doing with our resources and funds, I mean, it seems like it points in a direction towards dealing with a lot of the things that our friends and our families probably are frustrated with, especially 2+ years into a pandemic.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think the Cuban medical system, I mean, perhaps really in the United States, since Michael Moore released Sicko, which outlined a lot of this, I mean, it's very clear that, not only from sort of a principles and practices perspective, where I think the family doctor program, which Rania described, and the embeddedness of doctors in the sort of broader society, but really even just the focus on healthcare along with education. And of course, those two things sort of dovetail together as sort of key factors and pillars of the society to invest in above all else, and to really center society around human well-being, as opposed to sort of private profit, where human well-being is ultimately incidental, because everything that is produced and every service that is provided is designed to make profit, does make sense and does provide good health outcomes. I mean, I think the point you made about Cuba being significantly smaller and also significantly poorer is deeply notable, because when you compare it to countries that are comparable in terms of size, in terms of wealth, in terms of development challenges being in the global South, I mean, they're so far ahead of almost every other nation on the planet, and actually competing with the most developed nations on Earth. I think the only thing you can really say is that the structure of what they're providing, universal health care, free at the point of service, a major investment pillar from the point of view of how the country organizes its entire national budget and organizing how they exist as a society around human well-being, makes so much sense. And I think so many of the weaknesses we have seen in the context of the pandemic in the United States really speak to all of that. I mean, the fact that hospitals are filling up because there's not enough beds, directly related to the idea and the concept and the reality that we have been slashing beds for over a decade in the United States, because from a profit standpoint, you don't want to have too many beds. You don't really want to have crisis capabilities to be able to scale up quickly when you need it, because that in and of itself is not considered profitable. I think we've seen the inability to make basic protective equipment. We could go on and on and on, but really almost all of the weaknesses all along the chain in the US healthcare system that have been so ruthlessly and tragically exposed during this pandemic really are about the issue of priorities. And I think that's what's important about Cuba. I think that's what's important about the coverage we're trying to bring forward from Breakthrough News, is that really what's important is, yes, some of the specific practices and policies, which quite frankly are copied all around the world, and Cubans work all around the world in all sorts of countries, but also just the overall focus and embeddedness of human well-being as the center of how they are structuring and building out from that their society, I think is crucial for us to learn from here in the United States.
Yeah. I know. I hear this quote in my head from someone who's been a loyal subscriber of ours for several years now. We talked about this, Rania, last week, where it was like, basically, we can do this. There's no question about stopping this pandemic. It's just a question of whether you're going to put corporate profits before, you're going to prioritize people's
Right.
well-being ahead of the corporate profits. And obviously, keeping the capitalist economy intact has been the prime objective, as it always is. And they've not allowed the pandemic to supplant making sure that the capitalist economy functions. And another thing that I find really important about the work that you did is talking to those students that are at the medical school from the United States, and highlighting the way in which they're able to go get a medical degree or get medical schooling without having to go into total debt that they'll never be able to repay. At least it's going to take 2 to 3 decades to repay it, probably in total, and that they can get the sort of expertise they need to take up a job in a hospital or just as a primary caregiver wherever they decide to work, and which is important right now because we know the stresses in our own healthcare system where people are overwhelmed and they feel like quitting.
Totally. And that was a really interesting experience because these were American medical school students who chose to go to study at a medical school in Cuba that might, I think, be one of the biggest in the world. It's the Latin American Medical School in Havana, and it has students from like over 92 countries that have gone there. All of them are from developing countries, except for also from the US, from low income communities in the US, which was an interesting thing to see. That because we always talk about the U.S. having like little sort of bubbles of like poverty that are have situations that are comparable to parts of the developing world, and so these students from low income communities in the U.S. get to go to school for free, to medical school for free. And one thing I wish I had included in that video that I am kind of kicking myself not for including. I keep seeing people comment on this. Is yes. This school is in fact accredited through a school in California. So their training at this school in Havana does transfer over so they can go practice medicine and be doctors in the US. But the whole idea is that they'll come out of school debt free and they'll get to go serve in low income communities. And, a lot of times because you come out of medical school in such a big amount of debt, it encourages you, kind of like with the situation, if you get a law degree, it encourages you with the medicine to specialize into something that makes a lot of money, as opposed to maybe something that doesn't make as much money, but can serve more people. And so in this case, they can go be like primary healthcare providers in their communities in Chicago and in Philly. And we met a girl from Missouri and New York City in the Bronx. And so that was really cool to see. And I think it speaks to just how messed up our system is in the US, that that there are these students that go study for free in Cuba so that they could serve low income communities in the US, because otherwise it might not be possible for them to do that.
And also, before we move from Cuba, unless there's anything you wanted to say, Eugene, about the work that Breakthrough News has been putting on, I was going to ask you, Rania, because I know it was a total highlight of your trip to be able to meet Che Guevara's daughter, and that this was like something that I suppose when you travel, you don't expect to meet people who you're going to walk away saying, oh, that's a hero. But you probably are like, that's somebody who I look up to and think they've left quite a mark. And I'm honored to be able to meet them.
Yeah, I definitely felt that way. And also, we are putting out that interview. I did a sit-down interview with her on Breakthrough News. By the time this goes up, that'll be available to watch. I highly encourage people to go check it out. I mean, one thing that was interesting for me was I interviewed a lot of people in Cuba, and of course, like, I understand a very small amount of Spanish, so I grasped like what the topic they were talking about because I did ask the questions, but I didn't know exactly what they were saying. So it's been very cool for me to actually like go back and watch these interviews with subtitles, because I'm like, wow. But even though I couldn't understand everything she was saying, I could understand enough of it that she actually started crying during this interview when she was talking about she served in the Cuban International Medical Missions. She served in Angola, and a lot of Cubans who either served as doctors in Angola or served in a combat role in Angola, because Cuba sent people to go fight, have like very difficult to deal with like trauma from that experience because of the just amount of human like devastation they saw there. And she actually started crying when she was talking about, because she's a pediatrician, when she was talking about providing medical care to children in Angola. And then she also cried talking about her memories of her father. So it was really moving. I mean, at the end of that interview, everybody in that room was in tears.
Justo ya en el 61 comienza el bloqueo. Entonces, yo puedo decir que nací siendo una niña bloqueada, ¿no? Por Estados Unidos. Al inicio nosotros no entendíamos por qué. No, era como si fuera un juego de un niño grande con el hermano más pequeño Y si el hermano pequeño tenía un carrito, el hermano grande quería quitarle el carrito, ¿no? Y era una cosa así, es decir, si nosotros lográbamos obtener algo, allá venía Estados Unidos, van y trataba de quitarnos lo que habíamos logrado. Como no podía hacerlo muchas veces, entonces buscaba otros métodos muy crueles. Porque, por ejemplo, en mi caso que soy médico, yo conozco de medicamentos que hay en el mundo. Desgraciadamente, de los 10 medicamentos nuevos que salen hoy en el mundo, 8 pertenecen a patentes de Estados Unidos de Norteamérica. Por ley del bloqueo, nosotros no podemos adquirir esos medicamentos. Entonces, nuestros niños pueden tener patologías graves con los cuales podíamos resolverlas con esos medicamentos, pero no los podemos adquirir por el bloqueo. Es decir, el niño cubano está condenado a poder sufrir y hasta morir porque un gobierno no quiere que nosotros adquiramos los medios suficientes para esos niños. Entonces tuvimos que buscar alternativas.
Like, I'm also just kind of thinking, like, I'm so happy Breakthrough News exists because, like, I don't see, I mean, I've seen, there's some videos of Aleda Guevara that you can go watch, but not very many. And a lot of the people we spoke to, they're accessible people, but you don't see Vice or CNN or any of these big outlets with like massive resources speaking to these people. And I'm so happy that we at Breakthrough News have this capacity to fill in that gap, whether it's with Cuba or whether it's with Eritrea, which I know we're going to talk about, or with Ethiopia, because these massive outlets that have all the resources in the world, they don't use them to talk to the people that we're talking to. So anyways, there's that.
Yeah, and it seems like for all this work that you produced over the last couple months, these trips, a lot of it is owed to generosity on the part of people who subscribe, who follow your work. I'm sure you've got everyone's got a few major donors that they can turn to who are always there to support them. But without those people, independent media can't do this kind of work. I don't know if you want to say anything to that, Eugene.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% true. I mean, I think that in the context of what we have now, certainly sort of the channels by which you can get the word out have gotten significantly easier than when you had to have a printing press or a massive satellite TV studio, but it still does take a lot. And to be able to travel internationally, to be able to move around, to be able to set things up the way you want to set them up on the ground. And I think in a way it offers the opportunity for a tremendously liberating perspective. And I think I have always tried to sort of connect this to what we've seen in the rise of small dollar donations vis-a-vis the internet for more progressive candidates, people who are running outside of the two major parties, people who are maybe running in one of the major parties, but a little bit more on the fringes, to be able to raise relatively large sums of money in order to be able to compete. So you think about something like Bernie Sanders raising $250 million, if even a fraction of that, if, progressive leaning people in this country, the United States, were giving $10 million to various independent media efforts, you could see that a lot of the greatest work that we have could continue and also be able to scale up in a big way. I think it's one of those things that when we think about what our collective power together can do in terms of really changing the narrative in this country, I really hope people continue to think more about, because obviously there are certain things that you think about giving to. There are crises when you immediately give, because you're like, oh my God, there's a crisis. But that really over time, we've already shown through both the crises and some of the intermediate things, whether they be political campaigns or campaigning groups. Look at what just happened with, say, the bail funds in 2020 with hundreds of millions of dollars that was generously given by people to get people out of jail who are fighting against racist mass incarceration and police terrorism. And I think that if we think about that on an ongoing basis, we can start to really build a foundation to continue to grow what has already, I think, started to blossom into flower in terms of great independent media that's willing to take on the tough stories and put people in a position to be able to punch above their weight in terms of what we can produce, where we can go, and how we can do it.
I'm always impressed by what you can do if you can just get enough people to give even like $1 or $3. And I think especially if people can support ventures like Breakthrough News that don't solely sit around their apartments all day in New York City or DC and just riff on what they're watching on CNN or MSNBC, then you could truly have content that makes an impact. So let's get to Eritrea. And I suppose it's probably good to start with you, Eugene. And I know that you were in Ethiopia and then you left from Ethiopia to go to Eritrea. And I know because I was worried about both of you and all of you that when you were there, you were not able to use the kinds of communication services that are mostly available, especially in the Western world. But everything was fine. You were having a decent experience and trip. So I know you made the point, so I'll let you fold this into whatever you say, that there's a way in which Western countries intentionally keep Eritrea underdeveloped, and that you could speak to that in discussing what you saw on the ground when you went into Eritrea.
No, well, I really appreciate that. And I think that it's a really crucially important point to understand about Eritrea. I mean, it's obvious, you Google it and, you see the worst possible things, the, quote unquote, North Korea of Africa, which, says a lot about how North Korea is viewed in the West too. But all these other various sort of slanderous different informations designed to make you think it's the worst, the deepest, darkest black hole that ever exists, which heavily shapes people's understanding to the extent they even follow it, because like many topics on the African continent, people don't really know it. But I think the point of I think Eritrea is similar to many countries in the developing world, faces sort of like the basic structural realities of all countries in the developing world, which is that basically the entire global economy is structured towards servicing the needs of the global north. Now, of course, the growth of China has slightly shifted that, but not significantly, and especially for Africa, given the relationship between primary commodity production and consumption. But that being said, I think a lot of those structural challenges are consistent across all developing countries, the lack of real access to capital, the challenges even developing industries in the context of a global environment that, when you do have access to capital, discourages it, right? So if you're a poor country, you need money. It's hard to get money. The easiest places to get money, it's like the IMF and the World Bank. But then they say, if you take our money, you have to do these things that make you more dependent on the West. And really, honestly, Eritrea is a young country, just formed in 1991 after a long liberation struggle, has had quite a bit of challenges in terms of sanctions, in terms of isolation. I know one of the things that you have reported on quite a bit, and better than many other people, Kevin, is Julian Assange and the work of WikiLeaks. Well, you can read in WikiLeaks, in relationship to how the U.S. State Department and the U.S. government is addressing Eritrea, that really their policy, starting in a major way in 2007 to 2009 and continuing until today, though it wasn't all sweetness and light before that, has been to do what they can to isolate the country. I mean, there's a State Department cable that WikiLeaks did reveal. And, thanks you also, of course, to Chelsea Manning for making it possible for a lot of these diplomatic cables to be at WikiLeaks. But it reveals that the U.S. was going around the world to any country that was providing aid to Eritrea that was significant. And they were trying to do whatever they could and put pressure on them to cut the ability to cut the aid, to try to isolate them explicitly. That's their goal. And you can find many different conversations between U.S. officials and Ethiopian government officials, between U.S. officials and EU officials, between U.S. officials and themselves, essentially trying to promote sanctions and trying to promote isolation of Eritrea, principally because they were doing things that went against the U.S. writ in their broader region. They were unwilling to participate in the destabilization of Somalia, which was a major U.S. goal. They were unwilling to participate in the cordon sanitaire that was being placed around Iran, and were willing to deal with Iran and have relations with them. They were sanctioned by the United States for trading with North Korea. You see it all over the WikiLeaks that the U.S. is complaining. Well, they're talking to Cuba, they're talking to Venezuela, all these countries that are, against the United States. They were labeled anti-Western. So there are a number of different development challenges that I think they would have anyway, and that almost all similar countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, already have, which is, of course, rooted in the history of colonialism and the contemporary reality of imperialism. But they also have been able to, they also have had to face a significant campaign of demonization, of isolation, and of sanctions, which have heavily stunted what they're doing. So there's more I can say about what we saw on the ground, but I think that context is really important to understand so many of the slanders and misconceptions and distortions that are put out there about Eritrea.
And then, Rania, what did you take away from being on the ground in Eritrea? I'll just be very, very broad and indefinite in my question.
Eritrea is this place that no one really knows that much about, because of the fact that there is such an attempt to like have a blackout on it. And the only things that are available, if you read about Eritrea, is like it's a bad place. It's so terrible. Everybody there is miserable. Everybody wants to leave. Like if you go to YouTube and you put in Eritrea, one of the first things that'll come up is this Vice report that that is called like something like Eritrea, the North Korea of Africa.
Oh God.
And yeah, and I know and Eugene has a good comment in response to that framing, but and I'll let him get to that in a moment. But you know, it's just Eritrea was really interesting because, you know, on top of everything Eugene just said, to see it on the ground, it was actually really inspiring to see the ways that they've tried to mitigate the worst impacts of being so isolated by US sanctions. Um, they have a really interesting development model that has a lot of socialist aspects to it, particularly with like the medical system, also with education. That is kind of like has a lot of parallels to Cuba, in fact, but you don't ever hear about that side of Eritrea. And they also are like really proud of their liberation struggle, and they're also politicized because of their liberation struggle. And that like informs how they function as a country. Everything is about self-sufficiency. Everything is about basically not being like a lot of other African countries that are kind of like just these capitalist states that are completely dependent on outside aid, that are run by like US aligned oligarchs. And where the vast majority of the country is like living in poverty, while there's like a handful of elites that have all the money and resources that are aligned with like Western transnational companies. And you know, Eritrea doesn't want to be that way. And I think that's another reason why they're so punished. And they really go out of their way in terms of their policies to make sure that they don't have to rely on the outside. So we got to see a lot of interesting things on the ground, like what they're doing with farming, for example. And they invest a lot of money in like building dams and building infrastructure in rural areas, so where people can like grow food and their kids can also still go to school. And like we actually visited these dams and farms, and like that was really cool. And also, I don't know, I mean, it was just it was like Eritrea. The other thing that was interesting about it, it was a super safe place. I think it's like the safest. It might be, if I'm not mistaken, might be like the safest country in Africa or something. So it was like the kind of place where you can like walk around in the middle of the night and be totally fine. It's the kind of place where like you could probably drop your wallet and someone will find their way to give it back to you. I mean, if you think about like American cities, that's not exactly that like something you can expect to happen if you drop your wallet. So that was also really interesting too, to like see the level of safety there, and kind of like the health of society is just much different than a lot of the places that are aligned with the United States. And I think Eugene could probably speak more to that. I think one interesting things about getting to go on these trips to Eritrea, Ethiopia, Cuba. I know Eugene went to Haiti last year. And I think Eugene can speak more to this, but is to just kind of be able to compare the places you've been to, because there are a lot of things that are different and that also you can like juxtapose, that you can sort of like use as markers, or they're kind of like reflections of the way these countries' economic systems function. And so I don't know. I think that's something that I actually want to hear Eugene talk a little bit about that, because he got to go. He's been to South Africa, he's been to Ghana, and he got to go to Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I'm kind of curious, like how those different places compare to you, and what you think the differences say about the kind of governing styles and economic models they have.
No, it's a good question, and you know, all great countries in their own right. But yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the things that's most obfuscated about Eritrea. I mean, you know, for instance, they're above the sub-Saharan average, above the sub-Saharan African average in life expectancy, in literacy, in infant mortality, and rural electrification. And, you know, I could go on, and you made the point about the dams, the hundreds of dams that have been built, and so on and so forth. And you look at other countries that are being 100% embraced by the United States, and they have worse social indicators all the time. I mean, Chad is one of the main U.S. allies in West Africa, Central West Africa, plays a major role in the so-called anti-terrorism campaign, gets money, gets guns, everything like that. On every single front, their social indicators are far worse than Eritrea. You look at Nigeria, one of the richest countries on earth, which has in many cases worse, and many of the things I've just mentioned, and many others too, actually, worse social indicators than Eritrea. Now, of course, it's a very different country, much larger country, but it's also been existing for a lot longer without any U.S. sanctions on it. In many ways, it's shameful that they are still in this situation, even South Africa. So, yeah, I think when you compare them, there are a number of things that come up. I mean, certainly vis-a-vis South Africa, both security and income inequality. I think that's the biggest difference between Eritrea and a lot of countries I've been in Africa and other places, is that since they do have a form of development that is heavily based on social solidarity, you don't see these huge extremes of income inequality. So there are certainly places that are much more wealthy, like Nigeria, like South Africa, like Kenya, for instance, where you can go to these places where you're living as well as you are anywhere in the first world. The people there are, many of them, just as rich, often equally as complicit in many of these first world corporations. That's how they got there. But then you go not that far from there, and it's like the worst possible living standards on earth. I mean, Kenya,
Yeah.
has Kibera, the world's largest slum, and then it also has Wesley, which is one of the most beautiful suburbs on the planet. And you don't see that kind of difference and huge difference inside of Eritrea. So I think that's a big difference between most of the other countries in Africa and Eritrea. I think many other countries in the developing world. And obviously, when you look again at what they're focusing on, even though they have many, many challenges, like how can you have the challenges they have, which they will freely admit, in terms of irrigation, in terms of access to water, in terms of ability to have food self-sufficiency, and still have a higher life expectancy than many, probably dozens of other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It's because they're putting more stress on healthcare, which means that even though people are still struggling in a lot of ways, they have better access to deal with the knock-on effects of the poverty and the underdevelopment that have been forced on Africa. Rural electrification. I mean, you look at a lot of places that are U.S. allies, where like less than 10% of people have access to electricity. Why is Eritrea 30% ahead of them? Because they're focusing very heavily on making sure that whatever the other challenges are, they're doing the best possible to provide people access to electricity, which means you can have satellite television, which means you can have radios, which means you can have different things that others don't have. And so ultimately it shows that the whole sort of riff on them, that they're just like deliberately starving people and ruining people's lives, is not true. That they do face many challenges, but that comparable to their peers in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, which is I think how you have to really compare countries, they quite frankly are doing quite well. And I think there are many countries that are much richer and much more developed that could take a page from their book about how to reduce the inequalities in their own society, which is something we're seeing more and more in many countries as people are starting to look more to Eritrea and a number of different places, and their African diplomacy is very robust. So it's a little bit to speak to what Rania is saying, I think, there about the demonization and the North Korea piece of it, which is like, North Korea is also very misunderstood. So and it's like the relationship between Eritrea and North Korea in that sense is because they have this demonization. You can say anything about them and people will believe it, even though it's not true. But again, when you compare them to their peers, it looks very differently in the context of, where countries are in terms of quality and standard of living.
Well, when I hear what you're saying, Eugene, about what Eritrea is able to do, and Rania, you as well, is that if you make the choice to not be a U.S. military outpost, then you're not going to be beholden to this outside force that is effectively colonizing your country. And so then you get to make things priorities that you would like. But it seems, I don't know as many of the specifics as you probably do, Eugene and Rania, but it seems like with Chad, if you're prioritizing the interests of the U.S. military and the security policies that are being imposed on Chad, then you're going to put taking care of your own population's needs in the background, and like that's not going to be able to take priority. I mean, you can see that to some extent. I only have loose knowledge of it, but like in Nigeria, if you're going to make Shell Oil's corporate interests the priority, then you're going to run roughshod over entire populations inside of your country who need you to take care of their well-being and health. And also, what happens when you can't provide healthcare as a priority because your system's going to expose the damage and devastation that those outside forces are doing to your people? Because then those people who work in those institutions are going to be able to document how you are betraying your people. So I think of all of those things in listening to you talk about your trips. And then now's probably a good time to get into Ethiopia. But maybe if you want to ask, I'm curious about this. Knowing that we're putting the burden on all of these countries, particularly in the continent of Africa, to reduce their emissions, to deal with all of their problems, to be the ones that we put the burden on to become carbon neutral before like Western countries, because we see the fiercest and worst impacts of climate change. They're going to affect these countries the worst. But then it's like, well, then you have to do it. You're the priority. I mean, you're underdeveloped, and if we were to develop you, we're just going to add to the global emissions. So I'm kind of interested in, when you were in Ethiopia, I know you were there during a conflict, and that was the focus of a lot of your work, is what was going on with the conflict. But obviously, to some degree, climate always plays a role in wars.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And I think that, with the conflict in Ethiopia, that's directly the case. I mean, when you look at why the United States was backing this regime change effort in Ethiopia, obviously one major reason why is the client state of Egypt under al-Sisi is in a deep conflict with Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is, I think, going to be the 7th largest hydropower project on earth, and opens up a lot of opportunity for these deeply underdeveloped countries in East Africa to have, not only in the context of their development, to have access to huge amounts of clean energy, but it also then, of course, reflects the struggle over water resources in the context of our world, where clean water is becoming more and more scarce. And I think in the context of countries like Egypt that have many different challenges with climate change and the growing of desertification, and the same thing's happening in Sudan and other places, the issue of water is becoming more of an issue of war. And I think a lot of people have really actually sort of pointed this out. You can certainly see it as well in West Africa, in the Sahel, and the impact of climate change on making all of the conflicts that exist in that broader Sahelian region even more intense than perhaps they already would have been. Conflicts between herders and farmers, which also exist in East Africa, which, as there's less, arable land, less water, other things like that, become sharper and sharper and sharper. And so I think that really this has become maybe an underrated issue in how we look at global affairs. But I certainly think vis-a-vis Ethiopia, it's playing a big role. And I think it's interesting because when you look at the social development goals of the United Nations around climate change, which, by the way, Eritrea has met the social development goal around climate change, which is to take concerted action to reduce carbon emissions. When you actually look at a world map, you see many of the countries doing the best on that social development goal are, in fact, in Africa, which is, sort of a double-edged sword. Part of the reason why they're doing very well is the nations are so underdeveloped, and the infrastructure and other things are so underdeveloped because of neocolonialism, that since they're starting from so low, it's easier to actually use sustainable methods to do the development that you do, which means that you can take more aggressive steps, which is a good thing. But it is sort of a result, I think, of this deeply unequal reality of the world we live in, which is worth considering. But I do think that it opens up these new ideas and these new possibilities of Africa, which is a continent with huge potentiality from the point of view of sustainability, about how hydropower in particular, but also solar power and so on and so forth, are going to be used to sort of drive development in a way that can be actually consonant with keeping the planet from being totally destroyed. But I think all across the continent, just like all across the world, we're seeing that the inability to really deal with and address climate change is driving a lot of the inequalities that exist. And the context of climate finance and the fact that the global north, I mean, already they're supposed to be providing $100 billion a year to the global south to deal with climate finance in order for people to have just transitions and mitigation that makes sense. That in and of itself is not enough money. But even if you just take the fact that they're not even anywhere close to that, and they're saying that it may be a couple years before they can even meet that, then we can see that really in the context of all these different wars, that's going to get worse and worse. And then you look at how the U.S. security and the Western security strategy overlaps that. And this speaks a little bit to one of the last points you were making, Kevin, is that the way the U.S. approaches these things is, who is following our regional agenda to keep these places geopolitically in our camp? And where those countries will get unlimited amounts of weapons and security related money and so on and so forth. And they often very rarely do anything to actually address the security situation. But what you always see is human rights abuses against their own people tend to increase. So you've got the United States and the West sort of working really in tandem with the changing climate to turn this into a spiral of death and destruction as they continue to buttress the forces that are willing to stoke the flames of all the underlying lack of underdevelopment, the poverty, the lack of state capacity, the lack of spending on public services that inflame these conflicts, plus climate change, which inflames the conflict. And then that in and of itself, starts to become this negative spiral. And then anyone who tries to step out of that is then demonized and cut out of the broader concept of aid, development, and other things that can help them come up. So, I mean, you can see it's a really vicious circle and a really vicious cycle happening all across the African continent, driving a lot of these wars. And I think Ethiopia is no different than anywhere else. And I think climate change and the impacts of it, are a heavy, heavy factor in what we're going to see moving forward. And the world's either going to come together to address this issue, and I think in a broader sense be able to address these conflicts, or it's not, and we're going to see, I think unfortunately an intensification, especially as the United States and Europe are scrambling to try to hold on to Africa as much as possible.
Whew. Preach. I mean, no, I couldn't have said it better like that. And that applies to everywhere. That applies to Latin America, that applies to the Middle East, that applies to Asia. Everything Eugene just said. Oh, Kevin, I think you're muted.
I think I am. Can you say a bit about going to these places where the TPLF and their forces had come through and ransacked areas? To me, some of the video you captured of the damage is probably the more shocking video that you came away with from your trip to Ethiopia, to see the devastation. And then maybe just give some attention to the ultimate dilemma that the government has in dealing with these forces, especially when they are the country that they are, that they're not going to be able to convince the world that their government is trying to manage this security threat fairly, because this group's able to fashion itself as a kind of like resistance force that should not be oppressed. They're able to manipulate human rights organizations and say that it's wrong for the government to try and stop us.
I'll speak a little bit to the devastation that we saw. I would compare it to it reminded me a lot of what I'd seen after like groups like ISIS or the various like jihadist groups that went through into like that were kicked out of various towns in Syria and Iraq. It reminded me a bit of that in terms of the level of violence, particularly sexual violence against women, that was quite systematic. That was pretty shocking. We talked to women who were essentially gang raped by TPLF fighters who had taken over their towns in the state of Amhara, which is south of Tigray. And from what they were telling us, it seemed pretty clear that this was not just like random acts of sexual violence. It was widespread, and perhaps the fighters had been encouraged to do it, or at the very least were incited by bigotry that was being used against the Amhara, because they would tell a lot of the people that they raped, like, you're a donkey, you're not human, you're Amhara, like you shouldn't even have babies. We're doing this as revenge because look what Abiy did to our women, and so on and so forth. And so that was really shocking. The other really shocking aspect was just to see the level of destruction, which actually this was different than what I saw in Syria and Iraq, because there was a lot of destruction and looting, but at the same time, the groups that took over various towns, whether it was ISIS or Jaish al-Islam or Nusra, they did attempt to govern. Like they took over the towns in an attempt to take over the country. So they did institute laws, right? Like they did like fix roads. They did try to govern. But the TPLF, based on what they did in these places, that they would come through and take over for either a few weeks or a few days, or in some cases a few months, it didn't seem like they were trying to govern. They were just kind of using the town to sustain themselves by taking the food, taking the fuel, and also using strategic areas as places to set up base, to go further towards the capital or to whatever strategic area they needed in order to fight back against the government. But they didn't seem to. They also just destroyed every aspect, anything that represented the state, like whether it was like the local, what could be compared to the DMV or post office. They destroyed In the case of Lalibela, which is a World Heritage Site that Eugene made a really good video about, kind of showcasing the people's stories that we talked with there and showcasing some of the destruction. They destroyed a clinic, they destroyed the delivery room, they destroyed the hotels, they destroyed the airport in Lalibela, which is the entire town is dependent on for tourism, because this is a place that people around the world come to visit because of their historic churches that are like built into the mountains. And so this is the kind of destruction that we saw. They cut the electricity and cut the communications, which were still being repaired when we visited these places. And people still felt really unsafe. They were scared there would be TPLF attacks or ambushes because they had just recently left. And the scars people are living with, I mean, they had family members killed, sometimes in front of them. Their children saw atrocities committed against their parents in front of them. So, you know, the level of trauma is quite widespread, and it's really shocking the amount of attention that Ethiopia was getting in this last year in the mainstream media, and none of it, I mean, like a tiny fraction, maybe like 2% of it, was even focused on the huge amount of destruction and atrocities that were committed by the TPLF.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Eugene.
No, I think that's a very good point. And I think, you look at the media, I mean, you even look right now, what's happening, where the TPLF, by the way, is continuing to fight in a far state, people saying that there's fighting, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced. But, the most recent statement from the UN Office of Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs actually states that the situation of malnutrition for small children is worse in Amhara and Afar than in Tigray. I mean, those are their numbers. And yet that is getting absolutely no focus in the world media. The only thing you hear is, oh, well, there's no aid getting into Tigray. There's a so-called genocide. You never really hear much of anything about what's going on in Afar and Amhara, but the exact UN numbers that are being used and quoted by the world media to address the humanitarian situation in Tigray, which is undoubtedly poor, is never actually mentioned. And the context of the fact that a significant part of the reason why, perhaps the main reason why, aid cannot even travel into Tigray in a larger amount is the fact that the TPLF has continued to fight. I mean, first, last summer, there's a unilateral ceasefire and an opportunity for more aid to get in. This is what the international community was calling on the Ethiopian government to do. It happens. And then the TPLF launches a whole new offensive into other parts of Amhara and Afar, which then, of course, worsens the humanitarian situation because aid can't get in. You see the same thing happen this time, right around Christmas. There's essentially a unilateral ceasefire by the Ethiopian government saying we're not going to go any further into Tigray for a range of different reasons. And then almost right away, they start waging a war yet again into Afar, where the main road that comes in to Tigray with aid is coming from, and thus making it significantly more difficult for aid to get in. So really using humanitarian aid as a weapon, and using, in fact, the suffering of the people they claim to represent as a lever to push forward their regime change efforts. And I think it speaks very, very heavily to how this conflict has been massively manipulated on a global stage. And I think you're right, Kevin, it's a tricky, challenging issue, and Ethiopia is at quite a turning point in, I think, its history. It's a struggle for the definition of its own national identity. I mean, we're talking about a country that is the product of sort of the emergence of feudal empire building colliding with the scramble for Africa and the desire of African people to be independent and not controlled by Europe. There's a range of different legacies and histories and complicated cross-cutting opinions about, how those histories played out. And in the context of one thing that I think is universal in Ethiopia, that the vast majority of average everyday people want to see their lives improve, a reduction in unemployment, a reduction in poverty, growth in terms of what's happening in the country, but how wealth is produced, how it's distributed, how you deal with the legacies of not only underdevelopment but also discrimination in the context of trying to create a level of equity and equality in the 21st century. Those are all deeply complicated questions. They're wrapped up in a long history and a contemporary reality that also includes, armed struggle and violence. And I think so much of this right now is all on the table in Ethiopia. And rather than really try to talk about that and find a way for the international community to intervene in a way that could facilitate a positive resolution of a lot of these questions, you see the United States doing everything possible to promote the TPLF, literally the most divisive actor in the past 40 years of the country, who ruled it for 30 years in a way that was so bad, their own coalition allies threw them overboard in 2018 because it was impossible to hold back the tide of resistance that was rising across the country to this form of rule. So, I mean, it really is pernicious on the part of the United States to take this terrible entity like the TPLF that's destabilized all of Eastern Africa to promote this fake narrative that somehow they're freedom fighters, and to drive a deeper wedge, or at least attempt to drive a deeper wedge into Ethiopian society at a moment where it seemed like, and I think still seems like, there's a lot of opportunity and possibility for a much more positive future.
Mm-hmm. Well, I believe for at least a decade plus that I've been aware of these issues, that one of the worst things about our global media is just how little attention gets paid to each individual African country so that we can understand what's happening internally. I mean, I took a class when I was in college that was a formidable experience that shaped me on colonialism in Africa, with a teacher who had some experience going to school in Tanzania, who was part of the civil rights and anti-apartheid movement here in the United States, who had a loose connection to Martin Luther King Jr., having been asked to brief him on some of these African issues in the past. And we actually did an interview with him on unauthorized disclosure. But the things that I learned was just incredible. And I've always felt that, like, if you can do one thing in journalism with your resources, it would be to pay attention to the amazing cultures and people that are on the ground who live and inhabit this country. Because usually it's, I mean, the old joke, it's kind of cliche at this point, but I have such a visceral reaction when I was first introduced to it in this class. But it's like, everyone really does think a lot in this country that, like, Africa is just a country.
Yeah, it's
Africa
sad.
is a country. There's and if you ask them about each of these individual places, it's like they almost are being asked to know counties inside of a state. It's like, what's the difference between Tanzania and Zambia, if they even know of those places? I mean, I think they know South Africa. I think they've heard of Egypt. Good luck being able to find other places on the map. Probably Congo. I bet they could probably tell you Congo.
I think you're being too generous.
Okay. Well, they made a movie, and didn't they go there and there's a big gorilla, and so maybe they might have some kind of experience. But
Jesus Christ, yeah.
But so I wanted to squeeze in, as we wrap here, clips of this State Department press secretary being a total tool, being asked about
his name is a tool name. Like, you're Ned Price. Like, you're never gonna have a Ned Price who isn't a loser.
Okay,
like,
so I have this clip queued up. So the thing that went viral was Matt Lee questioning Ned about this. But in order for people to understand why Matthew Lee, who works for Associated Press, was set off, you have to hear this minute of what he said. Like, people have to know what the State Department is outlining and how completely insane it is what they're claiming.
We have previously noted our strong concerns regarding Russian disinformation and the likelihood that Moscow might seek to create a false flag operation to initiate military activity. Now, we can say that the United States has information that Russia is planning to stage fabricated attacks by Ukrainian military or intelligence forces as a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine. One possible option the Russians are considering, and which we made public today, involves the production of a propaganda video, a video with graphic scenes of false explosions depicting corpses, crisis actors pretending to be mourners, and images of destroyed locations or military equipment, entirely fabricated by Russian intelligence. To be clear, the production of this propaganda video is one of a number of options that the Russian government is developing as a fake pretext to initiate and potentially justify military aggression against Ukraine. We don't know if Russia will necessarily use this or another option in the coming days. We are publicizing it now, however, in order to lay bare the extent of Russia's destabilizing actions towards Ukraine and to dissuade Russia from continuing this dangerous campaign and ultimately launching a military attack.
I just struck me that, like, that they might actually be projecting onto Russia, because that's what they funded in Syria. Like they funded like the white helmets. I'm not saying all their videos were, but sometimes they just made shit up. They had like a production team, and that's what they're suggesting Russia. I mean, it's sometimes what the US says might sound insane, but they're actually just projecting stuff that they've participated in doing. But anyway.
Well, that's what I felt all throughout Russiagate when they talked about hacking. It's like, this is all, you're describing offensive hacking capabilities that the NSA has. So of course you think it's possible because you know you know it exists. You know
you've done it.
it's
You've done it. Yeah. Anyways.
But then also he doesn't do it with Matt Lee. So this is the best time for me to make this comment. The thing that struck me in watching that is has he ever read a teleprompter on camera before? What is this thing where he locked his eyes and he's like,
yeah, it was a little creepy. There's no doubt about
it was like
he's like a robot. He's like a robot. He's like, they're charging me right now. Like, I don't even know why.
So here's
battery is low.
So here's the viral exchange, and I cut it down so that this is just like the 2 best minutes.
What is the evidence that they play? I mean, this is like crisis actors, really. This is like Alex Jones territory you're getting into now. What evidence do you have to support the idea that there is some propaganda film in the making?
Matt, this is derived from information known to the U.S. government, intelligence information that we have declassified. I think you know.
Okay, well, where is it? Where is this information?
It is intelligence information that we have declassified.
Well, where is it? Where's the declassified information?
I just delivered it.
No, you made a series of allegations and statements.
Would you like us to print out the topper? Because you will see a transcript of this briefing that you can print out for yourself.
That's not evidence, Ned. That's you saying it. That's not evidence. I'm sorry.
What would you like, Matt?
I would like to see some proof that you you can show that
Matt, you have been
that shows that the Russians are doing this. Ned, I've been doing this for a long time.
I know, that was my point. You have been doing this for quite a while. You know that when we declassify intelligence information,
right. And I
we do so in a means we do so with an eye to protecting sources and methods.
Is not going to fall. I remember a lot of things. So where is the declassified information other than you coming out here and saying, my God, what is the evidence that you have that suggests that the Russians are even planning this?
Matt,
I'm not saying that they're not, but you just come out and say this and expect us just to believe it without you showing a shred of evidence that it's actually true. Other than when I ask, or when anyone else asks, what's the information? You said, well, I just gave it to you, which was just you making a statement.
Matt, you said yourself, you've been in this business for quite a long time. You know that when we make information, intelligence information public, we do so in a way that protects sensitive sources and methods. You also know that we declassify information only when we're confident in that information. If you doubt the credibility of the U.S. government, of the British government, of other governments, and want to find solace in information that the Russians are putting out, that is for you to do.
I'm not asking what the Russian government is putting out, and what is it supposed to mean?
That's crazy. I hadn't actually watched the whole exchange because it was like going viral while I was sleeping, and I actually was awake, so I'm so jet lagged, but I didn't want to wake up my partner, so I couldn't watch it. But like, the point is, I actually hadn't seen it, and that is so batshit insane that he was like, if you don't believe the U.S. and British governments, like, oh, because you've never lied, like that's crazy.
Yeah, and wild. I mean, kudos to Matt Lee, who I think has had many videos that I think many of us have seen trying to hold them accountable. But I mean, he does make a good point that I think is relevant. I mean, in this so-called video, if it does in fact exist, and I don't know if maybe they've released a video now at some point, I haven't seen it, but if you're saying that people are crisis actors instead of mourners, well, based on what? Like, I mean, are they also in a movie that just, premiered in Russia? How do you know they're not some random Ukrainian civilian? I mean, like, you think like the idea that like, well, there's no more proof we could give. We're trying to protect sources and methods when you've made a lot of just demonstrable claims that you think you could say, like, is it the way it's shot? Like, oh, it was in 1080p. And I don't think that in that kind of context, like, that could happen. I mean, like, you just feel like there's like a couple follow-on facts that you could have had to say, like, this is why I'm telling the truth. But instead you're like, I'm going to print out the transcript of what I just said and hand it to you. Like, and You know, Ned Price, that's not what he means. And that's the thing about these briefings, is that he's like so incredulous. Like, how dare you? How dare you ask me for evidence in any way, shape, or form? We saw the same thing with Jen Psaki, who, you know, a long line. I mean, saying that someone asking, because the ISIS guy they killed, they say the guy blew himself up, blah, blah, blah. And the woman was just like, well, what like evidence do you have that the guy blew himself up and it wasn't some other thing? And I believe it was a female reporter. I believe the context of why she was asking was in relationship to the civilian deaths. Like, I'm trying to get to the bottom of what really happened to see, did you actually do everything possible to avoid the civilian deaths, and so on and so forth. And, you know, I know now Jen Psaki has come out and said, oh, they didn't tell the whole story, blah, blah, blah. But she did more or less suggest that this woman was believing ISIS propaganda as opposed to the US government, which was, you know, shocking. And I think very much in line with Jen Psaki, who is generally very dismissive. I mean, we saw what she said about voting rights, you know, have a margarita and go to a kickboxing class. And notable, her previous job in the government was the job Ned Price has. So, I mean, it's the nature of how these people come up in the system to dissemble, to smear, to slander, to misdirect, to distort. I mean, that's probably all press secretaries anywhere in the world to some degree, because you're trying to shape the narrative. But I think that in the United States, it's uniquely untethered from reality, because the reality is so damning that rather than just you can't come out and claim it, because they're lying to the American people about what they're doing. If they were telling the truth, they could come out and claim it. But since they're lying, they don't want American people to know. The people of the world know, but they don't want America to be hip to the lies they're telling.
I think they're also, that's so true. And I think another like additional element to that, to why they're so like, what, you're questioning me, is because the US media doesn't. Like, so rarely does the US media ask for evidence when the US makes a crazy claim about Russia, that Ned Price is actually like, wait, what? Someone questioned what I just said. And the same goes for the ISIS stuff, because I'm whenever I read the New York Times or the Washington Post or watch CNN, because I hate myself, when they're like discussing either Russia or China, I'm always just like, these people just swallow anything that US officials say and they believe it. Like, they're like, so America rah rah, can do no wrong. And it's like, how can you still have that attitude after the last like 20 years? But they actually do. And that's why they work at the New York Times and the Washington Post, or get to anchor on CNN, because they're like they really are on Team America. So that's why I think Jen Psaki and Ned Price feel so entitled to not produce any evidence and to just accuse anyone who questions them of being a propagandist for the other side.
Yeah, well, first off, I've never met, one final comment before we were to wrap. I've never met a crisis actor. I don't actually know what it takes for somebody to become one, but I do feel confident in saying that Ned Price fits the type that I would be looking for if I wanted a crisis actor. I mean, that face is just easy to mold into looking like anything you could want. I feel like the makeup job would be pretty easy. In order, I know it might be uncomfortable for people, to put him into brown face or put him into black face or whatever, but I feel like he's got the face for a crisis actor.
I feel like he could be like dressed up nicely as like a zombie, like an extra in a zombie movie. Like, he just has the look. You could just put a little blood and like, give him a little more of a sunken face look. And
one final thing I will say about this that I do think is maybe it's
a serious comment now.
It's amazing how deeply right-wing discourse has penetrated into the broader culture. Crisis actors, red pills, cuts.
Yeah.
I mean, so many things. And whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, or has any real effect at the end of the day, I don't really know. I'm not making any big sort of meta point, but I am making a meta point about just sort of like the broader shift in right-wing. I mean, the fact that, Matt Lee was right. It was Alex Jones who introduced the issue of crisis actors vis-a-vis the issue of the Sandy Hook shooting. So the fact that now a State Department spokesperson is using that phrase, it's an interesting commentary on sort of how our culture is being, or the forces that are heavily shaping our culture. As much as I know everyone's super up in arms about how, woke culture or whatever is ruining America, I think it's notable to see how a lot of the right-wing cultural discourse has now become more mainstream.
That's a really good observation.
Well, and then just to put an exclamation point on what Rania was saying before we go, this was the New York Times that they put this out. And this is at the same time that those journalists sat there and showed how much bullshit Ned Price was saying, and then they ran with this headline. And there's no skepticism in this headline. Look at this. This is exactly like WMDs in Iraq all over again.
Exposes. The U.S. has exposed with a statement it said with no evidence. It's an that's exposing now. That's amazing. What a word.
And so this was Julian Barnes, name and shame, Julian Barnes at the New York Times. And I just gotta say, I mean, we've had some good fun with this, but I honestly just have to say that like they put more evidence when they claimed that Russia hacked the election than they did with this. Like they actually put out a document. They claimed 17 intelligence agencies had different levels of from good to like high level confidence in what was being said about and they tried to present something that would persuade people that this is what happened to the 2016 election to ruin the integrity of it. And here they're just like, I'm going to go before you and I'm going to make this statement and you're just going to believe me. And it's like, I guess we're supposed to, because this isn't Donald Trump's administration. Like, that's all. That's really all it is. Like, we're just supposed to believe what they say because deep down, we're supposed to believe they won't lie us into a war. But like, that's exactly what they're trying to do. Or worse, which is the conclusion I've come to, which is that they're not trying to start a war. They're just creating a crisis because they don't want Russia to be able to export natural gas to Germany. And they've already succeeded in stalling it. And now they want to destroy the project completely.
Very possible.
All right. So thank you both. Rania, you're always here. But thank you, Eugene. You're here. You're stuck. You're stuck with me. But this is, again, Breakthrough News. And you don't really have a URL that you send people to, do you? Just say go to YouTube.
We do
or
actually.
Go to
We do actually.
We do have breakthroughnews.org. It's probably not the main way we reach people, but you can go to breakthroughnews.org and you can go to @BT Newsroom on all your social media and youtube.com/breakthroughnews.
Excellent. All right. Well, it was good talking. And for everyone who follows Unauthorized Disclosure, thank you. And I'll just do good diligence here and just say, if anybody wants to support our work, this is our Patreon page at patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure. We also do have a presence on rockfin.com/unauthorized dis, but I know that we have to put up like warnings when we're on this site because we're going to talk about COVID in an intelligent way. And then people are going to like jump all over us and be like, no, I mean, there's a problem with Rockfin because
we've been red-pilled.
It actively rewards people who are saying the most insane, like Ned Price type things.
Yeah.
Like your crisis
He would
actor.
do well. He would do well on Rockfin.
He should go to Rockfin. I think he should try his ideas about Russia and Ukraine on Rockfin. That's where he should go. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. We'll be back next week with another episode.
Thanks for having me.